They didn't build those orphanages to save children. They built them to hide them. You may think you know what a sanctuary looks like, but these walls kept far more secrets than lives. The records whisper one story, the ruins another, and the truth waits in the spaces no one ever wrote down. Tonight, you will walk with me into what history tried to forget. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, adjust the pillow to fit your head, turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to stand at the edge of a medieval town at dawn, watching the first light spread over crooked rooftops and narrow mud streets, the sound that reached the ears would not always be the noise of waking life. More often, it was the thin cry of an infant left beneath a church wall, a sound so ordinary that people walked past without turning their heads. Hunger, war, and plague had turned these cries into part of the landscape, as familiar as the tolling of the morning bell. In a world carved by scarcity, a newborn's life was a fragile gamble that most families could not afford to play. Famine was not an occasional visitor, but a constant shadow. When crops failed, parents watched their food stores shrink day by day until only desperation remained. Bread grew smaller, bowls emptied faster, and the weakest were the first to starve. An infant who needed constant nourishment became a burden too heavy to carry. Mothers who could no longer produce milk faced a choice with no kindness in it. Those who survived the winter months did so by accepting that a child left at a monastery door might at least have a chance. However faint, war deepened this bleakness. Armies marched across the land, leaving burned fields, ruined homes, and widows behind them. Men who went to fight rarely returned, and their families were often left without protection or income. A newborn in such a household was more a sentence than a blessing. Many women, trembling from exhaustion and grief, carried their infants to the nearest church under cover of night. Their footsteps hurried, their breaths short. They did not kiss the child goodbye. Touching made it too difficult. They simply placed the small body on a stone step and walked away before their resolve broke. Plague took its share as well. Disease swept through communities with such speed that entire families disappeared in a matter of days. A baby might be found in a cradle beside a dead mother, or discovered hours later by neighbours who dared not enter the infected house. Those who survived the disease often faced another fate: abandonment by relatives too fearful to raise a child who might still carry the sickness. In villages accustomed to smoke and silence, a single infant's cry became the last living sound of a household extinguished. The death of infants was so frequent that no one spoke of it with surprise. In the harsh arithmetic of medieval life, survival was the exception. Many newborns died before their first month, their tiny bodies unable to withstand cold nights, bad air, or infections that had no cure. The burial of a child did not call for a ceremony. A shallow grave, a handful of earth, a quiet prayer whispered more out of habit than sorrow. Some babies died before they were even granted a name. They entered the world unnamed, and they left the same way. For the poorest families, the act of abandonment was not always accompanied by hope. It was often a blunt acceptance that the world simply had no space for one more mouth. A mother might cradle her child briefly, studying its face as if trying to memorize it for a moment she would never be allowed to revisit. A father might stand nearby, jaw clenched, knowing there was nothing he could offer except the illusion of a chance. They made their decisions not because they lacked love, but because love itself could not compete with hunger. Villages adapted to this reality with chilling efficiency. Places where infants were most commonly left became known without anyone needing to speak of them. The monastery gate, the stone alcove beside the well, the rear steps of the chapel, These were the places where the living deposited the lives they could not sustain. Monks sometimes found multiple infants in a single morning, wrapped in scraps of cloth or naked against the cold. Some babies were left with a token, a button, a torn ribbon, a carved piece of wood, symbols meant to help identify them if fate ever allowed a reunion. Most tokens meant nothing. Most reunions never came. The community rarely judged these acts. They understood the harshness of the world too well. A field that produced nothing meant death in slow motion. A plague that darkened the door meant death in waves. A war that swept through meant death without warning. Against such forces, an infant's life flickered like a candle in a storm. People saw abandonment not as cruelty, but as another symptom of despair. One more surrender in a life filled with them. The church, the one institution that might have provided relief, offered prayers more readily than food. Monasteries could take in only a fraction of the children left at their doors. Many infants were already cold by the time the brothers found them. Others were alive, but too weak to survive the day. The priests wrote their names in small ledgers, though sometimes they wrote nothing at all. Only a date and a brief mark to indicate the body had been received. The ledger pages grew heavy with such marks. To walk through a medieval town with open eyes was to witness a society quietly shaped by these losses. Young children wandered barefoot through the streets because they had survived what so many had not. Mothers carried their newborns tightly wrapped, guarding them not only from illness, but from the creeping fear that they might not live long enough to justify affection. Every household carried the memory of a child lost or abandoned. Every street held echoes of cries no one answered. Against this backdrop of hunger, a war, disease, and sorrow, orphanhood became not a rare misfortune, but a widespread condition. A child without parents was not an anomaly. It was a natural outcome of a world that seemed bent on consuming the weak. The number of abandoned infants rose with each catastrophe. Each failed harvest, each outbreak of fever, villages recorded their losses without shock, as though nothing else could be expected. And through it all, life continued. Markets opened, bells rang, fields were ploughed, and new children were born into the same uncertain world. Their fate depended on forces far beyond their reach, forces that cared little whether they lived or died. This was the foundation upon which medieval orphanages and foundling systems emerged, a society that produced unwanted children faster than it could bury them. In these streets, survival was measured by chance rather than protection. The air itself carried the quiet resignation of families who had run out of choices. Somewhere beyond this grief, another truth waits in the shadows, and it will not remain hidden for long. The entrances of churches and monasteries were never truly silent. Long before the brothers rose for prayer, small bundles often appeared on the cold stone steps. Bundles that shifted, whimpered, or cried out against the chill. These infants arrived without warning, carried through the darkness by hands that trembled with fear, shame, or resignation. A mother might linger for a moment, listening for the sound of movement inside, but she rarely stayed long enough to be seen. By the time the first monk opened the door, she was already gone, leaving behind only a child wrapped in whatever cloth she could spare. Some babies were placed carefully in woven baskets, tucked among scraps of cloth or bits of wool in an attempt to ease the cold. A few were left with notes written in shaky ink, asking for mercy, offering a name, or explaining in broken words that the family could no longer endure. Others carried small tokens, a half coin, a ribbon, a wooden charm, symbols meant to ensure recognition if the parents ever gained enough stability to reclaim them. These tokens, though treasured at the moment of separation, often became the only proof that the child had ever belonged to anyone at all. As abandonment grew more common, monasteries sought a way to handle the constant arrival of unwanted infants without forcing mothers to confront the clergy or endure the shame of being seen. Thus appeared the foundling wheel, a wooden cylinder built into the wall, able to rotate from outside to inside. A mother could place her baby in the wheel, give it one final glance, and turn the mechanism. With a soft creak, the infant vanished from her sight and into the dim corridor beyond. A bell sometimes rang to alert the brothers, though in many places there was no bell at all. Only the quiet thud of wood meeting stone to the church. This device represented an act of mercy. It allowed infants to be received discreetly and saved women from public disgrace. Yet the wheel also introduced a chilling detachment. A child could be surrendered without a word spoken or a witness present. The anonymity protected mothers, but it also erased the child's past in an instant. Once the wheel turned, the baby became a foundling, stripped of lineage and story, reduced to a body in need of shelter. Inside the monastery, the brothers moved quickly to retrieve the abandoned infants. Some were still warm from their mother's arms. Others had already begun to lose heat, their skin pale and stiff. The monks examined the tokens, recorded whatever details they could, and prepared the child for baptism. A new name was chosen. Simple names. Common ones. Because dozens of foundlings passed through those halls each year. Records grew thick with repetition. Entire generations of children, labelled identically, distinguished only by dates or brief notes in the margins. Though the wheel seemed like a portal to safety, it was not a promise. Many infants died within hours of arrival, too weak or too cold to survive. Others lived but carried scars from their earliest moments. Malnutrition, infection, tremors that never fully left them. The wheel could receive them, but it could not protect them from the realities of the institution that awaited them inside. Still, mothers continued to come. In the darkest hours before dawn, cloaked figures moved quickly through narrow alleys. Clutching their infants close, they approached the wheel not as a refuge but as a last resort, a choice made when all other options had vanished. Some paused with their hands on the wooden rim, whispering a final plea or apology. Others turned the wheel without hesitation, as though the act had already been rehearsed in their minds many times. The community grew accustomed to the device. Children playing in the square knew what it was. Villagers walking past the monastery recognized the faint squeak of wood turning. It became another fixture of medieval life. Like the well, the market stall, or the church bell, except that this fixture absorbed the consequences of hardship. Sin, illness, and poverty. The wheel did not judge, it merely received. Inside the monastery walls, the presence of foundlings multiplied the daily burdens. Resources were scarce, and the brothers struggled to provide adequate care. Cradles were shared, blankets were thin, and food was rationed. Yet every time the wheel turned, they responded, compelled by duty or faith, or simply the unspoken acceptance that this was the world they inhabited. A world where infants arrived without names, and mothers disappeared into shadows. The foundling system became a quiet mechanism by which society handled the consequences of suffering without addressing its causes. It absorbed the children no one could keep, concealed the despair of families, and maintained the illusion that compassion was being offered. In truth, it was a system built on silence. Silent surrender. Silent acceptance. Silent grief. The system that received these abandoned infants functioned with a calm precision that hid its cruelty. Behind the monastery walls, a quiet mechanism waited for whatever the night delivered, and each time the wheel turned, something vanished into the darkness that few ever dared to question. Foundling wheels worked in silence, hidden inside the thick stone walls, where no one lingered long enough to witness what passed through them. Mothers approached in the hours before dawn, when the streets were empty and the only light came from distant torches flickering against damp alleyways. They walked quickly, holding their infants close, their arms tense from the weight, not of the child, but of the choice they were about to make. The wheel itself was simple. A wooden cylinder built into the monastery wall, smooth from years of turning. One side faced the street. The other opened into the dim interior, where monks waited for whatever the night delivered. A woman would place her baby inside the shallow compartment, adjusting the cloth so the child would not roll or slip. Sometimes she hesitated, her fingers trembling as she traced the curve of a tiny cheek or the thin edge of a blanket she had sewn herself. Other times she acted with a swift, almost mechanical motion, as though she feared that pausing even a moment would shatter her resolve. Once the child was laid inside, she gave the wheel a firm push. The wood creaked, rotated, and swallowed the infant into the darkness beyond. By the time the mechanism stopped, the mother was already fading into the shadows. Head bowed, steps hurried, her breath uneven in the cold air. Inside, a monk would hear the wheel's dull thud and rise from his seat, carrying a small lantern. He approached the opening with practiced steps, his expression solemn but not surprised. Nights were long, and the wheel turned often, so often that he no longer expected quiet hours. When he lifted the child from the compartment, the lantern light revealed the familiar details: scraps of cloth wrapped too thin for warmth, a small ribbon tied around a wrist, or, in some cases, nothing at all. The babies arrived, curled, shivering, their cries muffled by blankets damp with mist. The brother checked for signs of life, though he carried no medical knowledge beyond instinct and prayer. Some children were warm and squirming, their breaths steady. Others were cold to the touch, their skin greyed by the night. A few took weak breaths that faded as he held them, their bodies relaxing into stillness before he could summon help. He registered each one in the monastery ledger, assigning names that repeated through the years, creating generations of children who shared identities not by blood but by abandonment. The wheel's design offered anonymity, but it also created distance, a distance that consumed every person involved. Mothers left without a trace. Monks retrieved infants without knowing their origins. Villagers passed by the wall each morning, aware that the wheel had turned again, but unwilling to wonder about the fate of the child inside. The mechanism became a quiet agreement. Those who abandoned would not be questioned, and those who received would not seek answers. Children who entered through the wheel rarely knew the truth of their arrival. They grew up believing the monastery's walls were the only world they had ever known. Some were told their mothers had died. Others were told nothing at all. Silence was considered protective, though it often deepened the emptiness that shaped their early years. The wheel erased not only lineage but memory, replacing family with uncertainty. The sound of the wheel turning became part of the nightly rhythm of many towns. Residents heard the faint creak, but learned to ignore it, much as they ignored distant cries or rumors of illness. The device represented the community's compromise, a method of managing desperation without confronting the suffering that caused it. Each rotation concealed another tragedy wrapped in cloth, another life redirected into the unknown. Sometimes, a monk opening the wheel found two infants placed together, siblings who would never know each other, separated upon entry and raised apart. On rare occasion, he found a child with a note written in a hand, so shaky the letters nearly collapsed into one another. These notes begged for mercy, for safety, for a chance. Some mothers asked the monks to keep a particular token with the child: a carved button, a torn piece of embroidery, hoping fate would someday bring them back to claim their little ones. Yet such reunions were exceedingly rare. Time eroded both memory and opportunity, leaving the tokens as remnants of a story no one could complete. The wheel itself aged over the decades. The wood darkened with moisture, its grooves deepened by use, and its hinges loosened until they groaned under the weight of each turn. Brothers discussed repairing it, but the idea of removing the wheel felt unsettling. as though tampering with it might disrupt the fragile balance of the community. They knew the wheel was necessary, even though they wished it were not. The world outside the monastery offered few alternatives to women whose lives were defined by poverty, violence, or illness. Some nights, the monks heard crying long after retrieving the child. The sobs echoed off the stone walls, mingling with the draught that seeped through cracks. It was impossible to tell whether the echo came from the infant inside or from the mother outside, hidden in the darkness, still close enough for her grief to carry through the silence. Those who tended the foundlings learned not to look out into the street, for they knew they would see nothing but a retreating figure swallowed by night. The wheel provided a way for society to discard responsibility without confronting its failures. It allowed communities to pretend they were helping while ignoring the hunger, war, and disease that made abandonment a necessity. The wheel turned because the world around it refused to change. The mechanism worked smoothly because so many depended on its quiet efficiency. Between each rotation lay a truth no one wished to acknowledge. Somewhere within these walls, a deeper reality waited to surface in ways few were prepared to face. Most medieval orphanages stood under the authority of the church, their walls rising from the outskirts of towns like stone reminders of duty and resignation. From the outside, these buildings appeared calm, with narrow windows, simple roofs, and wooden doors worn smooth by years of use. Villagers walked past them with a quiet understanding of what lay within, children whose lives had begun with loss, now shaped by the routines of monastic discipline. To many, these orphanages seemed charitable places, established to rescue abandoned infants from hunger and death. Yet those who stepped inside quickly realized that survival came with a different cost. Monks supervised every corner of these institutions. Their footsteps echoed through long corridors, marking the rhythm of the children's days. They rose before sunrise to prepare morning prayers, and the children followed, lining up silently on cold stone floors. The prayers were long, the church unheated, and the children's breath misted in front of their lips as they whispered words they barely understood. The monks believed that prayer cleansed the soul and instilled order, shaping the children into humble, obedient servants of God. For many children, the ritual became a blur of voices and aching knees. Education in these orphanages was simple. The children learned to read passages from sacred texts, carefully tracing faded ink with fingers still clumsy from youth. They memorized verses not because they comprehended them, but because memory was one of the few skills the monks could teach. Their labor filled the rest of the day. Boys swept courtyards, chopped wood, or tended small gardens that struggled to yield enough food for the community. Girls washed linens, prepared meals, and scrubbed floors until their knuckles reddened from cold water and rough fabric. Tasks were assigned without question, for work was considered a spiritual practice. The church portrayed this system as an act of redemption. Caring for abandoned children, even poorly, was seen as a way to guide lost souls towards salvation. Monks preached that raising these children was a divine responsibility, a chance to offer them spiritual refuge in a world marked by suffering. Many believed they were saving the children from the harshness of the streets, from sin, or from the fate of wandering as nameless beggars. But the institution itself often revealed a harsher truth. Children were shaped not only by faith, but by strict conformity. The daily schedule allowed little room for childhood. The sound of laughter was rare, discouraged as frivolous or disruptive. Instead, the halls carried the echoes of chanting, the scraping of wooden stools, and the muffled sobs of children who had learned to cry quietly so as not to be punished for weakness. The absence of affection was striking. Monks were stern, often distant, believing that showing tenderness would weaken the children's discipline. As a result, the children grew accustomed to handling their fears alone, sitting upright on hard benches with hands folded tightly in their laps. In winter, The orphanages grew unbearably cold. Thin blankets offered little protection from drafts that seeped through stone walls. The children huddled together for warmth at night, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. Food was scarce: watery porridge, coarse bread, and occasional vegetables from the monastery garden. The portions were small and carefully to stretch through the season. Hunger accompanied the children throughout their days, sharpening their awareness of every crumb. Though the monks believed they acted with righteousness, the structure they maintained exerted complete control over the children's lives. Each child's identity was reshaped upon arrival. New names replaced the ones their parents might have given. Records emphasized baptism dates rather than birth stories, as though the past could be erased with ink. The children were taught to accept authority without question and to fear straying from the rules. Disobedience brought swift punishment, harsh words, isolation, or physical discipline administered under the guise of correction. The orphanage walls kept the world out, but they also confined the children within. Few ever left before reaching adulthood, and even then, their paths were limited. Some were sent to work as servants in distant households. Others were guided into monastic life. Bound by vows they had little choice in making. The Church considered these outcomes honourable, believing that structure and duty were better than the uncertainty waiting beyond the gates. Still, the children sensed what they lacked. They saw families walking to market, heard mothers calling to their sons, and watched fathers leading their daughters through crowded streets. These glimpses stirred an ache they could not name, a longing that grew larger with each passing year. The monks offered explanations. A child without family should cling to God, not earthly attachments. But such words did little to quiet the emptiness inside. In quiet moments, some children pressed their hands against the cold windowsills, staring through warped glass at the world they were forbidden to enter. They wondered about their mothers, their origins, and whether someone somewhere remembered them. For many, these thoughts faded with time, buried beneath discipline and routine. For others, the questions deepened, forming shadows that followed them well into adulthood. The orphanage served as both refuge and constraint, a place where survival was possible, but freedom was not. It preserved life while diminishing identity, offering safety at the cost of childhood. And behind its walls, the Church continued to justify its methods as holy work, even as the children learned to navigate their days with quiet resignation. Life inside these institutions created children who endured far more than they understood. The tranquility of the monastery masked a much heavier silence. Within that silence, another reality waited to emerge, revealing truths the walls could no longer contain. The moment a child entered the orphanage, whatever fragments remained of their former life disappeared quietly, as though the world had agreed to erase them. The monks recorded a new name in the ledger, often choosing from a small list repeated so frequently that dozens of children carried the same identity. Their birth names, if they ever had them written anywhere, were absorbed into silence. No effort was made to retain lineage, heritage, or memory. These details were viewed as distractions from the spiritual path the institution imposed. A child without a past was considered easier to mold. The loss of identity happened gradually but thoroughly. Clothing brought from outside was taken away and replaced with plain garments identical to those of every other child. Any tokens left by parents, ribbons, wooden carvings, a torn scrap of patterned fabric, were removed and stored in small wooden boxes that the children were never allowed to see. These items, intended by desperate parents as markers of love, became artifacts hidden in locked drawers, gathering dust alongside hundreds of others that would never return to the hands that left them. The children grew up with the feeling that they had been born inside the monastery walls, even though they sensed something missing. Rules governed every aspect of their lives. They rose, ate, worked, prayed, and slept according to schedules that permitted no deviation. Questioning these routines was treated as disobedience. Resisting them was considered a sin. The monks believed discipline purified the soul, and they interpreted compliance as evidence of spiritual alignment. Children learned early that speaking out resulted in punishment, usually swift and delivered with an air of solemn duty. The threat of correction hung over them constantly, shaping their behavior long before they understood the implications. As the children grew older, the restrictions tightened rather than eased. Their world remained confined to narrow corridors, dimly lit prayer halls, and small workrooms that smelled of wax and damp stone. Opportunities to leave the monastery were rare and strictly supervised. Even those who reached adolescence were not granted freedom. Instead, they were prepared for lives chosen for them. Lives within the church or in service to households that required labour but offered little autonomy. The idea of choosing one's own path was never presented as an option. Dependency was cultivated deliberately. The monks spoke often of gratitude, reminding the children that without the church, they would have perished in the streets. This narrative, repeated daily, became a framework through which the children viewed their existence. They were told they owed their survival to the institution, and that obedience was the only appropriate response. Over time, many of them internalized this belief, accepting the monastery as both guardian and master. Punishment served as reinforcement whenever gratitude wavered. The children were corrected with methods that blurred the line between moral instruction and fear. A raised voice in the refectory might result in days of isolation. A moment of hesitation during prayer could lead to kneeling on cold stone until legs went numb. The severity of these measures varied, but the message remained constant. The children belonged to the monastery, and resistance carried consequences. Some children tried to imagine what life beyond the walls might look like. They watched birds settle on windowsills and fly away freely, leaving only the faint flutter of wings behind. These small moments stirred something inside them, an instinctive yearning they did not know how to name. But yearning had no place in the rules that shaped their days. The monks emphasized humility and the dangers of worldly desires, discouraging any attachment to the outside world. The absence of choice became so deeply embedded that many children stopped searching for it. They moved through their routines with quiet precision, each day indistinguishable from the one before. Their future, already decided, seemed less like a journey and more like a narrow path laid out in stone. Yet beneath the orderly surface, something unsettled lingered. A child might wake in the night with a sudden sense of loss, unable to explain why. Another might pause during chores, struck by a strange moment of clarity, an understanding that something vital had been taken from them before they could understand its value. These fleeting sensations faded quickly, swallowed by the rhythm of the orphanage. But they hinted at a deeper awareness that the children were not as malleable as the church believed. The institution masked control behind the language of salvation, offering care that concealed the absence of freedom. What appeared to be protection was, in truth, confinement. What was called guidance was, in reality, a quiet dismantling of identity. And while the walls kept the world at a distance, they also ensured that the children had no path beyond them. Everything within these walls was designed to shape lives that were never fully their own. The quiet obedience of the children hid questions they were never permitted to ask. Somewhere beneath that silence, a harsher truth waited to rise through the cracks that discipline could not completely seal. Discipline in the orphanage was presented as a form of moral instruction, a necessary shaping of young souls who were believed to be prone to disorder. The monks spoke of correction with an air of solemn righteousness, insisting that strictness preserved virtue. But behind these words lay a reality the children understood far too well. Punishment was a constant presence, woven into the fabric of their daily existence. The line between teaching and cruelty blurred until it was no longer visible. Physical punishment occurred with such regularity that the children scarcely questioned its purpose. A boy who whispered during prayer might receive a strike from a wooden rod. A girl who hesitated during chores could be forced to kneel for hours on cold stone, her legs shaking beneath her. The blows were often delivered without anger, which made them feel even colder. The monks believed they were performing a duty, not expressing emotion. Each act of violence was framed as a lesson meant to guide the child toward obedience. The orphanage halls carried the memory of these punishments. Wooden benches bore marks from restless hands gripping them too tightly. The corners of rooms seemed to absorb muffled cries that faded before anyone dared to respond. Children learned early to brace themselves for correction, their shoulders instinctively tensing at the sound of approaching footsteps. The anticipation of pain became as heavy as the punishment itself. Silence was demanded, not only in word, but in expression. Children were expected to maintain composure, no matter how frightened or hurt they were. Tears were viewed as weakness, and any display of emotion invited further reprimand. Over time, many learned to cry without sound, pressing their faces into their blankets at night so that no one would hear. Others forced their feelings inward, turning their fear into a quiet stillness that the monks mistook for obedience. Questions were not tolerated. A child asking why a rule existed or why a punishment was necessary risked harsher correction. The monks believed curiosity led to rebellion, and rebellion was considered sinful. As a result, the children internalized their confusion, shaping their understanding of the world from fragments of whispered conversations and the patterns of discipline they witnessed. Their minds grew around the rules like vines clinging to stone, adapting to the spaces allowed but never stretching beyond them. In the classroom, learning took on the same rigid structure. Mistakes in recitation were met with harsh words or strikes to the knuckles. Mispronounced prayers resulted in extended sessions of kneeling. Even when the children achieved accuracy, praise was given sparingly, as if kindness might weaken their resolve. The monks valued discipline over comprehension, ensuring that fear drove the process more than understanding. Labor offered no respite. Tasks were assigned with little regard for physical capability. Children carried buckets of water too heavy for their small frames, chopped wood with tools nearly as large as they were, or scrubbed floors until their fingers blistered. Fatigue did not excuse errors. In fact, tiredness often made mistakes more likely, and mistakes brought punishment. The work was framed as character building, a way to strengthen the spirit. But for many children, it simply deepened the exhaustion that shaped their days. Some punishments were administered publicly to reinforce authority. A child singled out in the courtyard felt dozens of eyes on them, yet no one dared offer comfort. Witnessing the suffering of others became a lesson in obedience, a reminder of what happened when rules were not followed. The silence that followed these events was heavy, settling into the hearts of the children who watched. Despite the severity, the monks rarely viewed themselves as cruel. They believed hardship refined the soul, stripping away impurities and guiding the children toward holiness. The violence was not seen as anger, but as correction. The emptiness it left inside the children went unacknowledged. Pain became normalized, folded into the rhythm of prayer and labor until it seemed inseparable from the daily routine. Some children adapted by making themselves invisible, moving quietly through tasks, speaking only when spoken to, and lowering their eyes whenever a monk approached. Others developed an inner hardness, a protective shell built from suppressed emotion and learned caution. A few resisted in small ways. An extra moment spent lingering at a window, a whispered comfort to a younger child. But resistance carried risks too great for most to attempt. The orphanage's claim of moral guidance hid a deeper truth. Punishment served not only to enforce rules, but to maintain control. It kept the children compliant, fearful, and dependent on the very institution that caused their suffering. The lessons they learned were not spiritual truths, but the consequences of power left unchecked. Within these walls, discipline became a language spoken through restraint and pain. The children absorbed it until it settled into their bones, shaping who they believed they were allowed to be. Beyond that quiet submission, another form of suffering waited, reaching far deeper than bruises or trembling knees. Infancy within the monastery walls was marked not by the promise of new life, but by a quiet struggle that many would not survive. The newborns arrived weakened by hunger, cold, or illness, their bodies already bearing the weight of abandonment before they could open their eyes fully to the world. Some were found shivering in damp clothes, their breaths shallow and irregular. Others were discovered limp, barely clinging to life after hours left outside before the monks retrieved them. The moment they crossed the threshold into the orphanage, their chances of survival depended not on medicine or comfort, but on endurance and chance. The orphanage lacked the resources needed to care for such fragile children. Milk was scarce, and wet nurses were few. Most infants were fed with makeshift mixtures of watered grains that did little to nourish their small bodies. Feeding bowls were shared among many, rinsed only briefly between uses. The milk substitutes often spoiled quickly, especially in warmer months, and the infants who consumed them suffered bouts of sickness that drained their strength even further. A child crying from hunger became a familiar sound, echoing through the stone halls long after the rest of the orphanage had fallen asleep. Cold was an enemy the monks could not keep at bay. The orphanage walls, though thick, trapped dampness more effectively than warmth. Cradles lined the corridors and small rooms, each filled with thin blankets that offered little shelter from the night air creeping across the floors. In winter, frost formed along the edges of windows, and the breath of the infants rose as faint clouds that dissipated quickly into the darkness. Many newborns slipped into stillness during these nights, their bodies unable to hold the warmth needed to survive until morning. Infection spreads easily. Without proper hygiene or medical understanding, illness moved from cradle to cradle in quiet waves. A fever in one infant often marked the beginning of a cycle that swept through entire rooms. The monks attempted to isolate the sick, but their efforts were limited by space and lack of knowledge. A child who coughed through the night might be placed beside a healthier one by morning simply because there were no alternatives. The orphanage lived in a constant state of vulnerability, where the boundary between life and death was perilously thin. Monks bore the weight of these losses with stoic resignation. They lifted the smallest bodies gently, carrying them through narrow corridors to be prepared for burial. Death was recorded in the ledger with a brief line, sometimes only a name and a date, before preparations began for the next child who would inevitably fill the empty cradle. The repetition of this ritual etched itself into the daily rhythm of the orphanage. Life began and ended in patterns so steady that grief itself seemed muffled, absorbed into the stillness of the halls. The children who survived their earliest months often did so by luck as much as resilience. They grew slowly, their limbs thin and their faces pale. Many bore the signs of early deprivation, weakened immune systems, lingering coughs, or a persistent tremor in their hands. The monks viewed survival as a blessing, a sign that divine favor had touched the child. But survival did not mean freedom from hardship, only that the child had endured the first and most unforgiving test. The older children were painfully aware of how many infants were lost. They noticed empty spaces where cradles had once been, heard whispers among the monks, and watched new arrivals replace the departed with unsettling speed. Some of the older children lingered near the infant rooms, their expressions quiet and distant, as if trying to understand why some lived while so many others did not. They offered small comforts when they could, adjusting a blanket, humming softly, or holding a trembling hand. But these gestures did little against the stronger forces at work. The silence surrounding these deaths was perhaps the most haunting aspect of orphanage life. There were no ceremonies, no mourning rituals led by families, no graves tended with flowers. The infants disappeared into the earth as quietly as they had arrived, remembered by no one outside the monastery walls. Records of their existence remained locked away in ledgers, rarely opened except to add another name. Their lives left no imprint beyond a few lines of ink and the faint impression of a body once laid in a cradle. There were nights when a monk passing through the halls thought he heard the lingering echo of a cry that had already faded hours before. The sound could have been the wind slipping through gaps in the stone. Or it could have been memory. An echo of the countless infants whose voices had filled the orphanage and then fallen silent. Those who tended the children learned not to dwell on such impressions, for allowing themselves to feel too deeply risked drowning in helplessness. The youth who survived beyond infancy carried these early shadows with them. They grew older, knowing that life could disappear without warning, shaped by the understanding that many others had not lived to see their first steps or utter their first words. Their resilience was not born of strength, but of necessity, forged in an environment where survival itself was an exception rather than the rule. Life for the youngest was a fragile thread stretched thin against hunger, cold, and illness. The quiet losses that marked these halls became part of their unspoken history. Within that lingering silence, a deeper truth waited to emerge and reveal what the walls had long concealed. Daily life inside the orphanage unfolded in a landscape shaped by deprivation. The rooms where the children slept were long and narrow, lit only by small windows that admitted little warmth even in the summer months. Rows of shared beds lined the walls, their wooden frames creaking softly whenever a child shifted during the night. Most of these beds held 2 or 3 children, forced together not by comfort but by necessity. Thin blankets, patched repeatedly and worn smooth from years of use, provided barely enough warmth to take the edge off the cold that seeped through the stones. Winter made the nights especially harsh. The wind found every crack in the walls, slipping across the floor in drafts that felt like icy fingers brushing against exposed skin. Children curled tightly beneath their blankets, knees drawn to their chests, their breath forming faint clouds in the dark. The small hearth in the corner rarely held more than embers. The monastery rationed firewood carefully, saving most of it for prayer halls and kitchens. The sleeping quarters were considered low priority. If a child shivered uncontrollably, there was little to be done except endure. Meals offered little relief from the constant discomfort. Breakfast usually consisted of watery porridge ladled from a large iron pot that simmered over a low fire. The porridge carried the faint scent of grains but almost no flavour. The children ate in silence, their wooden spoons scraping against the sides of crude bowls chipped from years of handling. Lunch was often a piece of coarse bread, dry and uneven in texture, accompanied by a cup of water drawn from barrels that were rarely cleaned. The water sometimes tasted of earth or metal, leaving a bitterness on the tongue that lingered for hours. En rare occasion, the monks served broth made from vegetable scraps. But even this was thin and unsatisfying. Hunger was a constant presence, settling like a weight in the stomach, dulling the senses until the children grew accustomed to it. Some older children learned to stretch their meals by eating slowly, savouring each bite as though it might be their last, while the younger ones struggled not to cry when their bowls emptied too quickly. The lack of proper sanitation worsened the already bleak conditions. Insects thrived in the cracks of the wooden beams, and beneath the straw mattresses, fleas and lice were constant companions, biting at exposed skin and leaving welts that children scratched until they bled. In the warmer months, the air carried the faint buzz of flies drawn to the damp corners of the rooms where water collected. The smell of mildew mingled with the scent of unwashed fabric. Laundry was done infrequently, and drying clothes indoors only added to the humidity trapped by the stone walls. Skin infections spread easily among the children. Red rashes blossomed along their arms and legs, and some developed sores that refused to heal, irritated by constant friction and dirt. Without ointment or medical care, these small wounds often turned into larger problems. Children with fevers were moved to separate rooms, but the separation did little to prevent illness from reaching others. The orphanage simply did not have the resources to contain outbreaks. At night, the sounds of the dormitory revealed how deeply the conditions affected the children. Quiet coughing echoed from one end of the room to the other. Some children whispered to themselves, as if trying to soothe the discomfort of itchy skin or an aching stomach. Others lay awake, eyes open in the dark, listening to the shifting bodies around them. In these moments, the orphanage felt less like a place of refuge and more like a cold vessel where bodies endured because they had nowhere else to go. Chores only intensified the strain. The children cleaned the floors with cold water drawn from the courtyard well, their hands turning red from prolonged exposure. Dirt and grime clung stubbornly to the stone surfaces. And even after long hours of scrubbing, the air inside the halls felt heavy with the scent of dampness. Washing laundry meant bending over wooden basins for extended periods, the water quickly clouding with residue. The task irritated existing skin conditions and exposed children to new infections. Despite these hardships, the monks rarely acknowledged the severity of the living conditions. They attributed illness to moral weakness or divine testing rather than deprivation. When a child complained of pain or illness, the response was usually a brief prayer or instruction to rest. A rest that did little when the environment continued to erode their health. Cleanliness was encouraged in theory, yet the infrastructure needed to support it was absent. Some children adapted by lowering their expectations of comfort. They learned to sleep in brief intervals, waking multiple times during the night to adjust their blankets or reposition themselves against the cold. They accepted hunger as familiar, scratching at their irritated skin with resignation rather than frustration. Others resisted internally, sensing there was something profoundly wrong about living in such conditions, though they lacked the words to express it. The orphanage's environment shaped the children as much as any rule or lesson. It taught them that warmth was a luxury, nutrition an uncertainty, and comfort something that slipped easily out of reach. Their bodies carried the marks of their surroundings: thin limbs, pale skin, persistent coughs, and scars from scratching insect bites. Their minds learned to quiet the desire for relief, adapting to a life where basic needs were met only partially and inconsistently. The conditions surrounding them revealed the harsh truth of an institution stretched beyond its means. The children endured because they had no choice. Their suffering was absorbed into the quiet order of daily life. In the shadows of their endurance lay another reality, one that would expose the deeper wounds carved by years of neglect. Affection was a language the children in the orphanage never learned. No arms wrapped around them when they cried. No hands soothed them when nightmares broke into their sleep. No gentle voices told them they were safe. The institution kept its distance, under the belief that tenderness weakened discipline. As a result, the children moved through their early years without the warmth that shapes a sense of belonging. Their bodies learning stillness long before they learned speech. Monks interacted with the children through duty rather than emotion. They offered food, instruction, and correction, but nothing resembling affection. A child who reached out for comfort quickly learned that such gestures were unwelcome. Hands were gently pushed away. Cries were met with disapproval. A moment of vulnerability was treated as a distraction, something to be controlled rather than understood. Over time, the children trained themselves not to seek what would never be given. This absence of touch left subtle marks. Infants who should have developed strength through cuddling grew weaker instead. Their limbs stiff, their movements hesitant. Toddlers rarely smiled, their faces set in quiet blankness, even when playing with simple wooden toys. Older children walked with an unusual restraint, their posture rigid, as though bracing themselves against a cold they carried inside. Emotional expression became foreign to them, a concept they understood only in fragments observed from passing families outside the monastery gates. Conversations among the children were hushed and sparse. They did not know how to comfort one another, for comfort had never been modelled for them. When one child cried, The others simply watched in silence, unsure how to respond. A few tried awkward pats on the shoulder, imitating gestures they had glimpsed among villagers. But the attempts felt uncertain, incomplete. The idea of connection remained distant, like a story told in a language they could not fully grasp. The intellectual effects became clearer as the children aged. Without nurturing engagement, many struggled to absorb lessons. Their minds wandered, drifting into a fog created by years of emotional deprivation. They memorized prayers and repeated chores with precision, but deeper comprehension eluded them. Their thoughts remained tethered to the strict routines imposed on them, leaving little room for imagination or curiosity. Creativity faded before it had a chance to form. Simple questions that other children might ask. Who held me when I was born? Why did my mother leave? Never took shape in their minds. The absence of emotional grounding meant they lacked the internal framework required to explore such thoughts. They existed in a state of muted awareness, drifting through their days with a mechanical rhythm that made them appear older than their years. This emotional emptiness affected their interactions with the world beyond the monastery. When villagers visited, or when the children were assigned tasks outside the walls, they watched families with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. They saw fathers lifting their children onto their shoulders, mothers brushing dirt from small faces, siblings teasing one another with playful familiarity. These scenes carried a quiet ache that the children could not articulate. They sensed something vital existed in these gestures, yet they could not imagine receiving or giving such warmth. The concept of family became abstract to them, something spoken about in scripture, but not experienced in reality. They learned definitions from books and sermons, but the words floated untethered in their minds, lacking the emotional resonance that would allow true understanding. A few children whispered to each other at night, wondering what it might feel like to have someone call them their own. But even these whispers faded quickly, swallowed by the knowledge that longing held no place in their daily lives. As they grew older, the absence of affection hardened into a quiet resilience, built from necessity rather than strength. They learned to endure loneliness without protest. They learned to suppress instinctive desires for closeness. They learned to navigate a world that offered survival, but not tenderness. Their steps became steady, their expressions muted, their hearts shaped by the stillness that surrounded them. The consequences carried into adolescence and beyond. Many struggled to form bonds, uncertain how to interpret emotional cues or return affection. Some moved through life detached, observing interactions rather than participating in them. Others clung to the first semblance of attention they received, not out of love, but out of unfamiliar desperation. The orphanage had raised them to function, not to connect. Within the monastery, this detachment was seen as a sign of discipline, evidence that the children had learned obedience. But beneath the surface, something fragile remained. An unspoken wound carved not by harshness alone, but by the absence of warmth that should have been their earliest memory. The children moved through their world without the touch or tenderness that shapes a sense of self. Their silence grew heavier with each passing year, deepening the distance between their bodies and their hearts. In that growing emptiness lay a truth waiting to rise, revealing what becomes of a child who learns to live without being held. Outside the monastery walls, the world did not greet orphaned children with sympathy. Instead, it viewed them through a lens shaped by fear, superstition, and moral judgment. To many in medieval communities, a child without known parents was not merely unfortunate. Such a child represented the residue of sin, an echo of wrongs committed by adults who had vanished or refused responsibility. These beliefs seeped into every interaction, forming barriers the children could neither understand nor overcome. When they walked through the village streets on assigned errands, their presence often drew uneasy glances. Women paused in their work, hands tightened around baskets or broom handles, while men stepped aside with quiet reluctance. No one openly confronted the children, for doing so would seem cruel. Yet the avoidance was unmistakable. A path cleared, not out of respect, but out of an instinctive desire to keep distance. The children felt this separation long before they could articulate its meaning. Playgrounds and gathering spots offered little respite. Other children, raised within families and shaped by community ties, observed the orphanage children with a mixture of curiosity and mistrust. They whispered among themselves, repeating rumors heard from adults, that these children were the offspring of sinners, that misfortune clung to them, that their presence invited spiritual danger. Invitations to join games were rare, and when offered, they came hesitantly, often withdrawn at the slightest sign of disapproval from nearby adults. Names became another form of exclusion. Words like bastard or wretch followed them through the streets, not always spoken loudly, but often enough for them to hear. Even when the insults were muttered under breath, their impact settled deeply, shaping how the children saw themselves. These labels are attached to them like shadows, difficult to separate from their identities. They became reminders that, in the eyes of the community, the children were flawed before they even had a chance to grow. The market stalls offered daily demonstrations of this unspoken divide. When an orphanage child approached to purchase bread or grain, shopkeepers weighed their requests with a certain detachment. Transactions were conducted quickly, without the casual conversations commonly exchanged with other villagers. A few merchants even wiped the coins after receiving them, a gesture subtle enough to pass without comment, but obvious enough to sting. The children learned to expect this treatment, adjusting their posture to seem smaller, quieter, less visible. Religious teachings, though meant to emphasize compassion, often reinforced the stigma. Sermons spoke of sin, repentance, and moral decay, and the children seated at the back of the chapel could not help but wonder whether these lessons targeted them. Some monks offered kind words privately, but even kindness was edged with pity, as though the children's existence alone was a reminder of societal failure. This pity, though gentler than rejection, still marked them as different. The result was a persistent sense of distance. The children grew accustomed to watching interactions they were not part of, families sharing meals, neighbors exchanging stories, friends walking home hand in hand. These scenes revealed worlds of connection from which they were excluded. They observed smiles that did not turn toward them, laughter that did not invite them in, and gestures of warmth that remained out of reach. The world beyond the orphanage did not feel hostile, but it felt closed, as if woven from threads they were never meant to touch. Social isolation influenced the children's self-perception. Many internalized the idea that they were burdens, accepted by the orphanage only because no one else would take them. They did not question why they existed outside the circle of ordinary life. They simply learned to adapt. They avoided drawing attention, kept their voices low, and stepped aside whenever others approached. Over time, they carried themselves with a quiet resignation that made them appear older than their years. Inside the orphanage, the children rarely discussed the treatment they received from villagers. Their experiences were similar enough that words felt unnecessary. Instead, the shared silence between them formed an unspoken acknowledgement of their place in the world. They supported one another through proximity rather than affection, forming bonds grounded in shared circumstance rather than emotional understanding. What troubled them most was not the harshness of the labels or the coldness of the stares. It was the absence of any alternative narrative about who they might become, without families to claim them or communities to welcome them. The children were defined entirely by what others believed them to be. Potential and capability mattered less than the circumstances of their birth. In this way, stigma became a lifelong companion, shaping the course of their futures long before they reached adulthood. Even those who eventually left the orphanage carried the weight of their origins. They learned trades, joined households as servants, or worked in fields. But the suspicion that had followed them since childhood never completely faded. Some employers hired them reluctantly, viewing them as necessary labour rather than valued workers. Others offered opportunities but withheld trust. The shadow of Gun Nang Zahoy lingered long after they had grown into capable individuals. The children walked through their world under the weight of names they did not choose. Their quiet endurance masked the wounds left by years of silent rejection. A deeper truth drifted beneath that muted sorrow, waiting for its moment to surface through the lives that slipped beyond recognition. Within the orphanage, the smallest graves were the ones no one spoke of. They belonged to children who never lived long enough to be recorded, children whose names were never written in the monastery ledger, children whose bodies left the world without a single mark to confirm they had ever been part of it. Their existence slipped quietly between the days and nights of the institution, witnessed only by those who tended to them in their final moments and forgotten by everyone else. Infants were the most vulnerable. Many arrived already weak, left in baskets outside monastery gates, swaddled in thin cloth, their breaths faint and uneven. Some were cold to the touch by the time they were found, the night air having drained whatever warmth remained. Others lived briefly, their tiny fingers curling weakly around the hands of the monks before slipping away. The orphanage offered shelter, but it could not undo the brutal conditions these children faced even before entering its walls. When one of these infants died, the response was quiet and procedural. The monks wrapped the small bodies in simple linen, white and unmarked. There were no ceremonies, no candles lit in their honour, no prayers spoken aloud beyond the brief blessing each child received. Death was not an event to be questioned. It was an expected rhythm of life within the institution. The monks accepted it with solemn resignation, believing that the children's souls had returned to a place purer than the world that had abandoned them. The absence of names was not deliberate cruelty. It was the byproduct of a system overwhelmed by need. Record-keeping only applied once a child survived long enough to be considered a resident of the orphanage. Those who died within hours or days were handled gently but discreetly, their identities never recorded, their origins already unknown. The ledger remained a book of survivors, not a memorial for the lost. There was no burial ground within the monastery dedicated to these children. Instead, they were taken to the outskirts of the churchyard, where small, unmarked plots were prepared. The earth there was uneven, shaped by years of hurried burials carried out in silence. No stones marked the places where the infants were laid to rest. Grass eventually grew over the soil, covering each mound until it blended into the landscape as it had always been part of it. Visitors walking through the churchyard would never know how many tiny bodies rested beneath their feet. The monks rarely discussed these deaths among themselves. Their duties required emotional distance, a discipline they believed necessary to continue their work. But the older monks, those who had served for decades, carried quiet memories of countless children whose faces they had held only once. In rare moments of solitude, they would recall the weight of those small bodies in their arms, the stillness too final to ignore, the silence that lingered long after the burial was done. For the other children in the orphanage, the deaths passed almost unnoticed. They sensed the absence of a child they had seen briefly in a cradle or carried past in the hallway. But the routine of their lives left little room for reflection. They had grown used to the quiet disappearance of the fragile ones. Questions rarely formed, and even when they did, no answers were offered. It was easier not to think about the tiny bodies wrapped in linen, easier not to imagine what it meant for someone to slip out of the world without a name. Yet the impact remained, shaping the atmosphere of the orphanage in ways the children could feel but not articulate. The halls often felt too quiet, as though holding the echoes of voices that never had the chance to form. The air carried a weight that pressed gently against the senses, like a memory that refused to settle. Even the creaking of floorboards or the rustling of robes seemed softer in certain corners of the building, as if the space itself acknowledged the presence of lives that had passed briefly through it. The idea of being forgotten frightened some of the older children. Though they seldom expressed it openly, they understood enough to know that death came quickly to those who were weakest. They wondered whether anyone would remember them if they were the next to fall ill. The fear lingered quietly, shaping their behavior, pushing them to work harder, obey more strictly, and stay as healthy as their circumstances allowed. In a place where names determined who was recorded and who was erased, identity felt fragile. For the community outside the monastery, these unnamed deaths barely registered. People knew that many infants died young, especially those born outside traditional family structures. They accepted the loss as part of the world's design, an unfortunate but familiar reality. No questions were asked about the children who disappeared before they were introduced to the world, and no grief extended beyond the monastery walls. Without names, these children were not considered part of the community, and so their deaths did not alter its rhythm. Yet within the orphanage, their absence shaped the quiet moments between chores and prayers. The tiny graves were hidden from view, but their presence hung like a shadow just beyond the children's awareness. The institution continued its work, raising those who survived, burying those who did not, and holding in its walls the memory of countless lives that flickered briefly before going out. The brief existence of these children dissolved into the silent routines of the orphanage. Their presence faded without records or remembrance, lost beneath the steady rhythm of daily survival. Through that quiet disappearance emerges the unsettling question of what remains when a life leaves no trace at all. When the children grew strong enough to lift buckets, carry tools, or walk long distances without stumbling, the orphanage began sending them out as labourers. This practice was presented as a practical necessity, a way for the institution to maintain itself and for the children to learn useful skills. But the reality was harsher. The moment a child reached the threshold of physical capability, they became a commodity, something to be traded, requested, or loaned out to farms, workshops, or wealthy households. Their presence filled gaps in labour shortages, and their silence made them easy to exploit. Requests arrived regularly at the monastery, a landowner needing help during harvest season, a merchant requiring an extra set of hands in his storeroom, a household seeking a young servant to perform menial tasks. These arrangements were made quietly and without the children's consent. Payment, when offered, was given directly to the monks in the form of grain, unquoings, or promises of future favours. The children themselves received nothing. Their labour belonged to the institution that housed them, and the arrangement was considered mutually beneficial, though only one side truly gained. The departure of a child on their first day of labour followed a familiar pattern. A monk would lead them to the entrance gate, offer a few brief instructions, and hand them over to the waiting employer. No words of comfort were given, no assurances of safety. The children left with whatever clothing they owned, usually thin and worn, and with the quiet understanding that they were expected to endure whatever tasks awaited them. Many walked away with a sense of unease, unsure what lay beyond the walls that had confined them since infancy. Work in the fields was among the most punishing. Children spent long hours bending over rows of crops, the sun beating down on their backs while dirt clung to their hands and knees. They carried heavy baskets of produce, fetched water from distant wells, and followed the commands of overseers who rarely acknowledged their exhaustion. Breaks were infrequent, and meals consisted of whatever scraps the workers were given. When a child slowed from fatigue, a harsh word or a strike from a stick reminded them to continue. Complaints were not tolerated. Tears were ignored. In wealthier households, the work took a different but equally demanding form. Children scrubbed floors, polished metalware, carried firewood, and cleaned garments until their hands grew raw from lye and cold water. Their presence was valued only when they remained invisible, moving quietly through corridors, avoiding eye contact, responding promptly to commands. Mistakes were met with swift reprimands. Some households treated the children with a kind of distant politeness, but even then, they were not seen as individuals. They were temporary servants, replaceable and without protection. The children quickly learned that rest was a privilege granted sparingly. In some homes, they slept in storage rooms or beside kitchens, close enough to heat, yet too busy to find true comfort. In farms, they often slept in lofts or barns, wrapped in coarse blankets that barely shielded them from the chill. Their sleep was shallow, broken by early morning chores or the sounds of animals stirring nearby. Returning to the orphanage at the end of a labor term did little to ease their fatigue. The cycle resumed as soon as new requests arrived. Because the children worked outside the monastery's supervision, mistreatment was common. Employers saw little risk in pushing them beyond reasonable limits. A bruise, a cut, or a limp went unnoticed by the institution unless it threatened the child's ability to work. Even then, the monks viewed injuries as inevitable, the natural outcome of manual labor. No inquiries were made into the conditions that produced them. The children learned to hide their pain, knowing it would change nothing. What made this exploitation more insidious was the perception of moral righteousness attached to it. Landowners and wealthy families believed they were offering the children valuable opportunities. They framed their demands as acts of charity, insisting that the work built character and discipline. To them, the children should be grateful for the chance to serve. This belief insulated employers from guilt, allowing them to justify harsh treatment with ease. The children, conditioned to obedience, absorbed these messages in silence. They believed that their labor was the price of shelter, that their bodies owed repayment for every meal consumed within the orphanage walls. Some took pride in their endurance, mistaking resilience for worth. Others withdrew into a quiet numbness, performing their tasks mechanically, as though trying to separate their minds from the strain placed on their bodies. Once a child became known as a reliable worker, requests for their labor increased. This recognition offered no reward, only more days of strenuous tasks, more nights of restless sleep, more years of serving without acknowledgement. Childhood slipped into the background, replaced by routines that mirrored adult responsibilities long before the children were ready to shoulder them. Despite the hardships, the orphanage saw this system as essential. It eased financial burdens and built relationships with influential community members. The children's exhaustion was viewed as a necessary sacrifice, a practical exchange that kept the institution functioning. In quiet moments, when a child returned with a blank stare or trembling hands, the monks simply guided them back into routine. There was no space for grief or outrage, only the steady rhythm of work and obedience. The children's labor sustained the world around them while offering nothing in return. Their days blurred into cycles of toil that shaped their bodies and dimmed their spirits. From these unspoken struggles rises a deeper question about what remains of a childhood spent in service to everyone but oneself. Among the children raised within the orphanage, the girls faced a reality shaped by dangers that remained largely unspoken yet deeply understood. Their lives unfolded within the same stone walls, under the same routines of prayer and labor, but the risks surrounding them were sharper, closer, and far more intimate. The world beyond the monastery demanded obedience from all orphaned children, yet it demanded submission from girls in ways that stripped them of choice long before they reached adulthood. When girls were sent out as workers, they were viewed differently from boys. Their labor mattered, but their vulnerability mattered even more, though not in ways that protected them. Families who requested girl laborers often valued them for their silence and pliability, expecting them to perform tasks that blurred the boundaries between work and servitude. Girls moved quietly through kitchens, bedchambers, and storage rooms, carrying water, tending fires, washing garments, and cleaning spaces that demanded long hours and left little room for rest. But the physical demands were not the greatest threat. In many homes, girls worked without supervision, their small bodies passing between adults who recognized their powerlessness. Some households treated them with minimal courtesy, but others saw them as objects, extensions of service that reached beyond chores. The girls learned to recognize certain glances, the ones that lingered too long or shifted downward with unsettling intent. These moments filled them with unease, a quiet fear that grew heavier with each passing night. The orphanage knew such dangers existed, yet rarely addressed them directly. Instead, the monks offered vague warnings: be obedient, avoid causing trouble, stay silent unless spoken to camestick. These instructions did nothing to shield the girls from the advances of those who viewed them as unprotected and easily controlled. Many endured violations they could never name, their experiences swallowed by the expectation that they suffer quietly and return to work without complaint. Within the monastery itself, the risks took different forms. In certain secluded areas, where only select clergy had access, girls worked under strict supervision. Though many monks lived with sincere devotion, others exploited the power granted to them by their roles. Girls assigned to these spaces sensed the tension immediately. The way silence thickened, the way certain corridors felt too narrow, the way a closed door signaled vulnerability rather than safety. They learned to move carefully, speak little, and avoid being alone when possible. The emotional toll of these unspoken threats shaped the girls' behavior. They became cautious in their movements, attentive to the shifting moods of adults, hypersensitive to footsteps approaching from behind. Their childhood dissolved not through labor alone, but through constant vigilance, the need to anticipate danger long before it arrived. Fear, when sustained over years, became part of their posture: curved shoulders, lowered eyes, arms drawn close to their bodies as though shielding something fragile within. For many girls, the orphanage offered no future beyond servitude. Education was limited to basic prayers and simple tasks. They were not taught to read with the same consistency as boys, nor were they given opportunities to learn trades that could lead to independence. The idea of choosing a career or shaping a personal destiny lay far beyond their reach. Their skills remained tied to domestic labor: cleaning, cooking, sewing, tending fires. Tasks that tethered them to roles society expected them to accept without question. Some girls were taken from the orphanage not for work, but for marriage arranged by landowners or other benefactors who believed they were performing an act of charity. These marriages were rarely acts of kindness. Girls as young as 12 or 13 were bound to men significantly older, men who viewed marriage as a transaction rather than a partnership. The orphanage agreed to these arrangements under the guise of providing stability. But stability meant obedience, and obedience meant surrendering every trace of childhood the girl had left. Once married, the girls had no recourse. Their new husbands held authority over their bodies, movements, and futures. Pregnancy followed quickly in many cases, placing children into the arms of girls still navigating the bewildering transition from servitude to forced adulthood. If they faltered or resisted, the blame fell upon them, not the systems that had placed them in those positions. Those who remained within the monastic system faced a different kind of fate. Some were pressured into religious vows, not out of spiritual calling, but because the institution lacked resources to support them into adulthood. A life of service within the church offered shelter, but demanded silence and obedience in return. The girls, now young women, moved through the cloisters like ghosts, their identities shaped more by duty than by desire. The absence of choice marked every stage of their lives. Where the boys faced hardship, the girls faced hardship. sharpened by gendered expectations and vulnerability. They grew into women who had never been taught to hope for alternatives, who believed that endurance was the only path available to them. Their stories rarely appeared in records. Their voices rarely reached beyond the stone walls that shaped their early years. Yet the weight of their experiences lingered in the orphanage's atmosphere, in the careful steps echoing across cold floors, in the quiet tremors in their hands during prayer, in the wary glances exchanged between girls who understood without speaking. Their suffering remained woven into the institution's routine, unnoticed by those who benefited from their labor, but undeniable to anyone who paid attention to the way the girls carried themselves through each passing day. Their burdens were shaped not only by poverty, but by a vulnerability the world refused to acknowledge. Their silence revealed the depth of what they endured. Hidden beneath layers of duty and obedience, a darker truth gathers beneath that silence, waiting to reveal what becomes of a childhood stripped of safety and choice. Illness was a constant presence inside the orphanage, moving quietly through the halls like a shadow that never fully retreated. With no physician to call upon and no trained healer within reach, the children faced sickness with little more than whispered prayers and remedies rooted in faith rather than knowledge. The monastery's belief in spiritual intervention shaped every response to disease, leaving the children vulnerable to ailments that might have been manageable elsewhere. When a child first showed signs of sickness, persistent coughing, trembling chills, a flushed face, or eyes dulled by fatigue, the monks responded with solemn efficiency. They guided the child to a small, dimly lit room at the edge of the dormitory, a place reserved for isolation. Here, straw mats lay spaced apart, each one holding a child waiting for relief that rarely came. The air in this room was heavy, carrying the stale scent of damp fabric and the faint, metallic breath of fever. Prayers replaced medicine. A monk would kneel beside the child, reciting verses meant to ease suffering. But the child's body remained untouched by any form of real treatment. Holy water was sprinkled across foreheads slick with sweat, while small wooden charms were placed at the bedside as symbols of protection. These rituals offered spiritual comfort, but little else. Once the monk departed, the child was left alone to endure whatever illness ravaged their body. Common diseases swept through the institution with predictable regularity. Tuberculosis left children coughing through the night, each breath a shallow, painful rattle. The sound of it echoed down the stone corridors, a reminder of how helpless the orphanage was against a sickness that thrived in cold, crowded spaces. Malaria brought waves of fever and chills that left children shaking uncontrollably, their thin blankets unable to warm them between bouts of shivering. Skin infections, scabies, fungal rashes, and lice spread rapidly, marking bodies with red patches, blisters, and open sores that never seemed to heal. The children developed their own internal measures of fear. A mild cough meant little, but a cough that persisted for weeks signaled danger. A fever that did not break after 3 nights meant a long stay in the isolation room. A wound that turned dark around the edges foretold a painful decline. They learned to read their bodies in ways no child should have to. Sensing the difference between discomfort and death's early whisper, the monks did what they believed was right, though their efforts were shaped by tradition rather than medical understanding. Herbal mixtures were brewed from dried leaves and roots kept in small ceramic jars. But the doses were inconsistent and the ingredients poorly understood. These brews sometimes soothed symptoms, sometimes did nothing, and occasionally worsened the child's condition. Still, the monks relied on them, convinced that faith, combined with natural remedies, could withstand any bodily affliction. In severe cases, the sick child was isolated completely. A small chamber off the main hall served as a quarantine space. It held a single bed of straw, a wooden stool, and a basin of water that was changed infrequently. Children placed there often drifted in and out of consciousness, hearing only the distant murmur of chants from the chapel. Their world shrank to the rhythm of their breath, the ache of their limbs, and the awareness that help would not come. Some children recovered through sheer endurance, their bodies slowly finding strength again. They returned to daily routines thinner, weaker, and carrying the memory of long nights spent alone. Others never left the isolation chamber. When death came, it was quiet, marked only by the closing of small eyes and the stillness that settled in the room. A monk would arrive to offer prayers, wash the child's body, and prepare it for burial. No doctor ever examined these children, no diagnosis was recorded. The orphanage accepted these losses as part of its existence. Illness was viewed as a divine test, as suffering to be endured with humility. The children absorbed this belief, learning to accept pain without question. They rarely asked for help, knowing it would change nothing. They whispered to one another about fevers and sores, but spoke of death with the same muted tone used for chores or weather. Disease became another routine. What frightened the children most was not the pain, but the isolation that followed. In the silent chamber, they felt the weight of abandonment more sharply than the weight of sickness. No arms wrapped around them. No soft voices encouraged them. Their bodies weakened in solitude, and their fear grew in the absence of human touch. Beyond the walls of the orphanage, medical knowledge existed, though limited, but it rarely reached the children. Physicians charged fees that the institution could not afford. Even if help had been accessible, the monastery's reliance on faith over medicine meant it would not have been sought willingly. The children lived and died within the boundaries of belief, held by a system that saw disease as unavoidable rather than preventable. As the seasons shifted, illness continued its cycle. Winter brought coughing fits that echoed through the halls. Spring introduced infections carried on the damp air. Summer's heat intensified fevers. Autumn returned with chills and trembling. The orphanage maintained its routines. But beneath the prayers and strict order lay a quiet truth. Survival was uncertain, and health was fragile in a place without proper care. Their bodies bore the marks of illnesses left untreated, shaping their days with pain that never found a remedy. Their endurance unfolded in silence, deepening the shadow cast by every fever and cough. Behind that silence waits a darker understanding of what happens when care becomes a hope far beyond reach. Death inside the orphanage rarely announced itself with sound. It arrived slowly, gathering around a child whose body could no longer withstand fever, convulsions, or the long decline brought on by untreated illness. The monks, acting as caretakers, did what they could within the limits of their knowledge, but their efforts were shaped by devotion rather than medicine. When a child's life slipped away, it happened quietly, often in the arms of a monk who murmured prayers while watching the final tremors fade. The moments before death were marked by a stillness that made the air feel heavier. A child, suffering from a high fever, often lies motionless, except for the faint rise and fall of their chest. Their skin carried both heat and pallor, an unsettling combination that reflected the intensity of their condition. Sweat collected along their brow, dampening the linen beneath their head. Sometimes their lips quivered with words they were too weak to form. The monks knelt close, holding their hands in hopes that spiritual comfort could ease the bodily distress no remedy could soothe. Convulsions were common during the final hours. A child's small body would jolt with sudden force, limbs tightening and shaking uncontrollably. The monks tried to steady them, whispering scripture meant to calm the spirit, though it did nothing to relieve the physical torment. After each seizure, the child's breathing grew shallower, their gaze unfocused. Some stared at the ceiling, as though searching for something far beyond the room. Others closed their eyes, their lashes trembling, as though resisting the approach of sleep they would not awaken from. The monks watched these signs with sorrow, which they rarely expressed. Their training encouraged composure, yet the fragility of the dying children touched them deeply. They pressed cool cloths to burning skin, offered sips of water to parched lips, and prayed over bodies racked with pain. But none of these acts could slow the progression of illness. Without proper healing knowledge, the monks had only faith to rely upon, and faith offered comfort, but not a cure. When the end neared, the atmosphere shifted subtly. The child's breathing became irregular, shallow moments broken by sudden gasps. Their fingers curled inward, clinging to the monk's robe or slipping away entirely. The convulsions ceased, replaced by an eerie calm that signaled the body's surrender. Some children exhaled one final breath that seemed almost peaceful. Others left the world in mid-struggle, their bodies finally releasing the tension that had held them captive. The monk holding the child rarely cried, not because he lacked emotion, but because the orphanage had taught him to meet death with solemn acceptance. Tears were discouraged. They were seen as distractions from duty. Instead, he lowered his head, closed the child's eyes gently, and whispered a last prayer meant to guide the soul beyond the suffering it had endured. The room remained still, its silence deepened by the absence of breath that had once filled it. Other children rarely witnessed these moments, but they sensed death's presence afterward. When a monk emerged from the isolation chamber, carrying a wrapped bundle, the halls grew quieter. The children paused as they passed, offering small nods or simply watching the movement of cloth that concealed the body. They had grown accustomed to seeing companions disappear this way. Their acceptance did not come from understanding, but from repetition, a lesson taught by environment rather than explanation. The burial followed a routine similar to that of unnamed infants, though these children at least had a recorded presence within the monastery's ledger. The monks washed the body carefully, covering each limb with clean linen and binding the fabric with simple knots. The child's name was spoken during a brief blessing, but no eulogies were offered. The death was acknowledged as part of life within a place defined by scarcity, overwork, and fragile health. As the monks carried the body to the churchyard, the procession passed unnoticed by most villagers. Death among orphaned children was far too common to elicit alarm. The grave prepared for the child was modest, a shallow section of earth marked only by a wooden stake bearing a carved cross. There were no mourners beyond the monks. No families followed behind. No friends placed flowers upon the soil. The world did not pause to grieve for those who had never been granted a place within it. The monks returned to their duties soon after the burial, moving through the chapel and halls with the steady rhythm expected of their roles. Inside the orphanage, the daily routines continued. Chores resumed. Lessons began. Meals were served. The children observed this continuity with quiet acceptance, as though life demanded that they move forward even when confronted by loss. Their silence became the only tribute they could offer. But within that silence lingered something deeper. The children who had watched companions disappear felt the weight of their absence during the nights that followed. They lay awake on shared beds, listening to the faint creaks of the stone structure and wondering if their own bodies would one day grow too weak to rise. Fear mingled with resignation, shaping their outlook on life and death. They learned that survival was uncertain and that their existence depended on endurance rather than protection. Death in the orphanage was not dramatic or violent. It was quiet, almost routine. A companion that visited too frequently. The monks held dying children with the only comfort they could offer: presence. No one else mourned them. No one else knew the final expressions that passed across their faces. The world moved on, while the orphanage absorbed each loss without expectation of remembrance. Their final moments unfolded in arms that could offer prayer but not healing. Their passing slipped into the order of daily life, leaving no echo beyond a freshly turned patch of earth. From that stillness rises an unsettling question about how many lives vanished unnoticed, swallowed by a silence that never learned to grieve. For the children raised within the orphanage, the future was not a horizon waiting to be shaped by hope or ambition. It was a narrow corridor, predetermined and unbending, offering only a few paths, all dictated by the institution that claimed ownership of their lives. From the moment they were strong enough to work or recite simple prayers, their fates were quietly assigned, leaving little room for dreams, curiosity, or choice. The world beyond the monastery existed only as a distant concept, glimpsed through iron gates but never truly accessible. Some children were chosen for religious life long before they understood what devotion required. These decisions were often based not on spiritual inclination, but on practicality. A boy who learned prayers quickly, or a girl who moved with quiet obedience, might be deemed suitable for monastic service. Once selected, the child's days became filled with ritual, regular chants, hours of kneeling, and scripture lessons recited from memory rather than understanding. They accepted these routines because they had no basis for comparison. Their world had always been one of structure and submission. Others were assigned to agricultural labor. These children spent their youth preparing for lives as field workers, learning to till soil, tend crops, and handle livestock. Their training was relentless, leaving their bodies lean and their hands calloused long before adulthood. The monks framed this labor as a means of survival, teaching them that physical endurance was their only currency in a world that demanded strength from those born without privilege. The children rarely questioned this path. Fatigue left little energy for rebellion. Many girls, and some boys, were prepared for domestic service. They learned to scrub stone floors until their fingers reddened, to polish metal until their reflections appeared in warped shapes, and to sew garments with precision so that no stitch betrayed inexperience. These skills were practical but limiting, shaping futures confined to households where they would serve others with the same quiet obedience expected of them within the orphanage walls. They were taught not to speak unless addressed, not to ask questions, and not to expect gratitude. Education, in its true form, remained out of reach. Lessons offered by the monks were minimal: basic prayers, simple arithmetic, and occasional instruction in reading. Books were scarce, and those available were used to reinforce obedience rather than encourage thought. Curiosity was subtly discouraged. Children who asked too many questions were reminded of their place, told that understanding the world was a privilege reserved for those born into families, not those abandoned at monastery gates. Over time, the children learned to silence their thoughts, accepting ignorance as an unavoidable part of their existence. The most constraining element of their future was the impossibility of leaving the system without permission. A child reaching adolescence might wonder what life could look like beyond the stone walls. But such wondering held no real possibility. Departure required approval from the monks, and such approval was rarely granted. The institution relied on the labor of its older children as much as it relied on donations and prayer. To release them was to weaken its own structure. As a result, the gates that opened freely for employers and visitors remained firmly closed for those who lived within. Some children did attempt to escape, slipping into the night when the halls grew quiet, but the world outside, unprepared to accept them, pushed them back toward the only structure they had known. Villagers hesitated to offer shelter to orphans, viewing them with suspicion or pity. Employers refused to hire them without official sanction from the monastery. And hunger, harsher than any reprimand, eventually drove many runaways to return. Weakened and defeated, the monks accepted them back without anger, but with a renewed emphasis on discipline. Freedom, they reminded the children, was not meant for them. The emotional consequences of this trapped existence were profound. Children who grew into teenagers found themselves facing adulthood without the tools needed to navigate it. They moved through life as though guided by invisible rails, carrying out tasks with mechanical precision but lacking the internal compass that choice provides. Some accepted their circumstances with quiet resignation, believing that fate had determined their path long before they were aware of it. Others carried a subtle restlessness, a faint desire for something they could not describe, though they sensed it existed somewhere beyond the monastery walls. The system functioned smoothly because it demanded so little from the children except conformity. Their futures remained predictable: a life of labor, a life of obedience, or a life of religious service that demanded silence rather than fulfillment. None of these paths offered autonomy. None allowed the children to define themselves. The world had decided for them, and the institution ensured those decisions remained unchallenged. The children learned this truth not through explicit instruction, but through the steady erosion of possibility. Hope became something fragile, not nurtured but trimmed back whenever it tried to grow. As they moved through their days, their steps carried the weight of futures chosen by others. Futures shaped by necessity, not by aspiration. Their paths unfolded without choice, shaped by a system that demanded obedience above all else. Their silence deepened as the years passed, binding them tightly to fates they never agreed to bear. Beneath that silence gathers a harder truth, one waiting to reveal what becomes of lives steered entirely by others' hands. Belief held enormous power within the orphanage and the surrounding communities, shaping not only daily routines, but the way suffering itself was interpreted. In a world where illness and misfortune lacked scientific explanation, spiritual forces were often blamed, or invoked, as cause. Orphaned children, already burdened by stigma and viewed as living remnants of sin, became targets of rituals meant to cleanse, purify, or expel unseen forces. These practices emerged from fear wrapped in faith, turning the children into subjects of ceremonies they never understood and could not refuse. Some rituals began quietly, conducted in dim chambers lit by a single candle, whose flickering cast distorted shadows along the stone walls. A child would be led inside, their steps hesitant, their eyes searching for clues about what awaited them. Monks or clerics, convinced they were protecting the community from spiritual contamination, arranged bowls of water, bundles of dried herbs, and carved wooden symbols across a small table. The atmosphere felt heavy, as though the room itself recognized the weight of what was about to unfold. The rituals often began with chanting. The child stood or knelt in the center of the room while voices circled them, weaving patterns that sounded solemn but ominous. Sometimes water was poured over their head in abrupt bursts, cold and shocking, intended to wash away traces of evil. In other cases, smoke from burning herbs filled the space, stinging the child's eyes and lungs. They trembled, trying to hold still as instructed, but the discomfort often drew tears, which the monks interpreted as signs of impurity resisting expulsion. More severe rituals involved physical pain. Certain monasteries believed that evil clung to the body and could be forced out only through suffering. Children were struck lightly but repeatedly with thin rods made from woven branches. The blows delivered in rhythmic patterns meant to align with prayer. The pain left red lines across their skin, swelling into welts by morning. The monks insisted the process strengthened the spirit, yet the children felt only fear and humiliation. Their cries echoed softly in those stone chambers, absorbed by walls accustomed to such sounds. Some communities held even darker beliefs. They viewed orphaned children as vessels for misfortune, claiming that their abandonment marked them as inherently tainted. In these places, rituals aimed at banishing evil became harsher, driven less by devotion and more by desperation. A child might be forced to kneel on cold stone for hours while prayers thundered above them. Others were subjected to prolonged fasting, denied food or water as a way to weaken supposed spiritual resistance. A few were bound lightly at the wrists to prevent them from moving during ceremonies that lasted deep into the night. The line between ritual and abuse was thin, often invisible. Adults who believed they were protecting their community failed to see the harm they inflicted. The children learned that their pain held meaning only in the context of someone else's belief, that their suffering was justified if it brought comfort to those who feared unseen forces. In this distorted framework, the child's body became a battleground upon which spiritual struggles were imagined, though the only real wounds were the ones left on their skin and in their memories. Some rituals ended in tragedy, when a child weakened by illness was subjected to purification rites. Their fragile body sometimes could not withstand the strain. Convulsions mistaken for signs of spiritual struggle were actually symptoms of physical collapse. A feverish child, forced into icy baths, might slip into shock. A child already malnourished could faint during prolonged chanting sessions, their pulse fading unnoticed until too late. Deaths that resulted from these practices were rarely acknowledged as consequences of the rituals. Instead, they were framed as signs that the child's soul had been reclaimed by divine will. Fear shaped the silence surrounding these tragedies. The surviving children whispered among themselves, recounting glimpses of rituals they had endured or seen from afar. Their voices were soft, their expressions tense, as though speaking of these ceremonies might summon them again. They learned to avoid drawing attention to themselves, believing that compliance might spare them from becoming the focus of future rites. But obedience offered no guarantee. Selection often seemed arbitrary, dependent on the superstition of the moment or the suspicion of a fearful adult. The emotional toll was immense. Children who survived these rituals carried a tension that lingered in their posture, in the cautious way they approached adults, in the faint tremble that passed through their bodies when certain prayers were recited. Their trust was fragile, shaped by experiences that taught them adults could justify harm with conviction. They learned that suffering could be presented as salvation, that fear could masquerade as faith, and that their lives held little value when weighed against the anxieties of those who controlled them. Within the orphanage, the rituals continued because they were part of a deeply rooted belief system. The monks saw themselves as guardians against spiritual corruption, blind to the physical and emotional destruction these ceremonies caused. The children, lacking alternatives, endured the practices as they endured every other hardship, quietly, mechanically, hoping to survive another day. Their bodies became instruments for rituals meant to purify what others feared. Their pain unfolded beneath prayers that sought meaning in suffering rather than mercy. In the faint stillness that lingers afterward, a darker revelation forms about what faith becomes when shaped by fear instead of compassion. He had seen the ledgers many times, always sitting on the same narrow shelf, where dust collected faster than the ink could dry. The monks handled them without urgency, as though the names inside held no real weight, as though each line served a purpose far smaller than the life it claimed to represent. In these rooms, a missing entry was not a mistake, it was routine. He watched the pages curl at the edges, carrying only a faint memory of the children who once passed through these halls. Some names were written carefully, while others were no more than a mark made in haste, a gesture to acknowledge a child who might not survive the night. There were gaps in the sequence, stretches of blank parchment where something should have been written but never was. When dawn came, the monks rarely spoke about the disappearances. A cradle empty by morning did not spark questions, and a child who stopped appearing at mealtime was treated like a shift in the weather. The man had grown accustomed to these silences, the way they filled corners of the orphanage more densely than the cold. He had seen children carried out by older hands, wrapped in cloth, taken toward the back courtyard where the ground stayed soft. No entry was made for them. Their existence ended quietly, and the ledger remained untouched. Sometimes the monks whispered that the work was too heavy, that keeping perfect records was impossible when the number of abandoned children rose each week. But he sensed a different truth. The lack of names was not just negligence, it was a shield. A page without a name absolved the institution of responsibility. If no one knew who a child had been, no one would ask why the child no longer breathed. He noticed how often newcomers appeared without introduction. A basket was left at the gate. A bundle of cloth was placed outside the chapel door. A baby was carried in by a stranger who refused to look back. Their origins were treated as irrelevant. The monks wrote what little they could. Sometimes only the day and hour. He wondered how many of these infants were recorded incorrectly, or not recorded at all. Identity dissolved before it ever had the chance to form. The older children sensed this uncertainty. They moved through their days with cautious steps, never fully trusting that their presence mattered beyond completing chores or attending prayers. Some avoided the ledger room altogether, as if standing too close to those blank spaces might invite disappearance. Others stared at the shelves, hoping one day to find some trace of themselves, some handwritten line that would tether them to the world. Most found nothing. He remembered one winter when 3 children vanished within a week. Illness had spread through the dormitory, and the coughing echoed through the stone walls long after the bodies weakened. When he asked a monk how many had been lost, the reply was a simple shrug and a glance toward the ledger that remained closed. Later, he checked the pages himself. No new entries. No marks. Nothing. It was as though those children had never drawn breath. Over the years, the ledgers grew heavier, not with names, but with the weight of absence. Pages that hinted at stories no one would ever recover. Occasionally, he would encounter a line scratched out with thick ink, concealing a name that once had meaning. The monks said it was a correction. He suspected it was erasure. He understood the purpose of these omissions. The outside world would not ask questions about children whose names were lost. A missing record meant no trace, no claim, no memory. The orphanage could continue its work without accountability. The children left behind would continue to endure their small routines, unaware of how fragile their place in the world truly was. He learned, too, that some of the lost were not buried. They were simply gone, taken by sickness, by hunger, or by the hands of those who needed labour elsewhere. Their disappearance left no mark except the silence that settled afterward. It was a silence that stretched down corridors, seeped into prayer hours, and lingered behind every unfilled line in the ledger. As he aged, he realized that the greatest cruelty was not the hunger, nor the cold, nor even the punishments. It was the erasing, the way children could pass through an institution built to save them and still have no proof they ever existed. The pages told a story, but that story had more holes than ink. He continued to open the ledger from time to time, hoping that new names might appear with more care, more meaning. But the pages remained much the same. Quiet, incomplete, indifferent. These missing entries drifted through his memory like cold air, refusing to settle. They hinted that what was lost went far beyond neglected ink. What waited deeper inside the archive might reveal why so many stories were never meant to be recorded at all. He had walked through many orphanages over the years, but there were places he never forgot. Places where the air felt wrong the moment he stepped inside. The corridors were narrow and sealed, as if designed to prevent escape rather than offer shelter. A heavy latch hung on every door, and the stone floors stayed cold, no matter the season. He remembered how his footsteps echoed sharply, startling the children who huddled along the walls. Their eyes followed him without accusation. Only the quiet resignation of those who knew that nothing beyond those walls belonged to them. In one of the buildings, the windows were placed so high that even an adult could not see out. The children inside grew up without ever glimpsing the horizon. They learned to measure time, not by sunlight, but by the routine. A bell, a bowl, a prayer, a punishment, the sound of the outside world, wind, animals, and people never reached them. The silence was dense, the kind that pressed against the ears until thought itself felt muted. For children raised here, the world began and ended with locked doors. He remembered the smell first. It seeped through the entire complex: damp straw, unwashed fabric, and the sourness of illness that never fully left. The odour clung to the children, to their hair, to their blankets, to the wooden bowls they used each day. The rooms were crowded, and air barely circulated. Breath accumulated in stale layers. It was a smell that suggested not only neglect but confinement, a scent that belonged more to prisons than places meant to care for the young. Crying was common in these halls, but what struck him most was how quickly the crying stopped. A sharp word from a caretaker, a raised hand, sometimes just the sight of authority passing by. The children learned that quietness was the safest form of survival. Their voices faded into whispers, then into nothing. The walls absorbed everything. Fear, hunger, frustration, without ever returning an echo. He often wondered how long the children stayed in such places before they realized no one was coming for them. Some still clung to hope, watching the doors as though expecting them to open for someone they remembered. Others moved slowly, as if waiting for life itself to decide their next motion. He saw children who no longer played, no longer reached for one another, no longer asked questions. The environment trained them to make themselves small, and visible, and compliant. Meals arrived in large metal pots carried by silent adults. The portions were minimal and unchanging. A thin broth, a piece of stale bread. On rare days, a handful of vegetables. Hunger had become routine. None of the children complained. They lined up, received what was given, and sat along the walls to eat. Their bowls rarely clattered. Movements were small, careful, subdued. At night, the atmosphere shifted again. The floors creaked as the children settled on their shared mattresses. Coarse fabric pressed against thin bodies. Some slept immediately. Exhaustion, overpowering discomfort. Others lay awake, staring into darkness that felt endless. A few cried softly into their blankets, trying to muffle every sound. The older children watched them but offered no comfort. They had learned long ago that comfort was a luxury not encouraged here. He noticed how the caretakers travelled in pairs, rarely alone. Perhaps they feared the silence, or perhaps they feared the truth that silence revealed. Conversations were brief and functional, never warm. The adults moved with the precise efficiency of guards, not caregivers. Checking doors, checking beds, checking the ledger, checking that no one stepped out of line. The atmosphere shaped everyone inside, even those meant to enforce the rules. He had seen a child try to run once, not far, just to the courtyard, just toward the faint sound of wind beyond the walls. The chase was not long, and the punishment that followed was severe. After that day, the gates stayed locked permanently. The courtyard became nothing more than a memory glimpsed through a crack in the door. He carried these impressions long after leaving the building. The smell, the hush, the dim light, the guarded expressions, the rigid routines. They formed a portrait of a place that existed not for care, but for containment. Children did not grow up here. They endured. Every sound, every shadow, every rule reminded them that their world ended at the locked gate. He understood then that some orphanages were never meant to offer refuge. They existed to hide, to silence, to manage lives considered too small to matter beyond the institution's walls. The suffering inside was predictable, consistent, and invisible to those who preferred not to know. These walls held stories that refused to fade once seen. They hinted that cruelty could be normalized when enclosed tightly enough. What waited inside the final chambers of this system would push that quiet cruelty into something far more unbearable. Many who had once passed through the orphanage gates carried into adulthood a kind of quiet heaviness that never fully left them. A weight that settled into posture, breath, and the way they moved through ordinary spaces. It showed first in their shoulders, slightly lowered, as if anticipating correction, even when no one was near. Childhood had taught them to expect reprimand as naturally as others expected comfort. That early conditioning lingered in subtle gestures that most observers misread as shyness or reserve. Years after leaving the institution, they appeared in villages and towns where no one knew their origins. They worked in small shops, on farms, in fields, anywhere that allowed them to remain unnoticed. Tasks that demanded silence suited them. They moved with practiced precision, mirroring the routines forced upon them since infancy. Their quietness was not a choice but a survival mechanism, one formed through years of learning that speaking too much invited unwanted attention. People often described them as calm, steady, or strangely composed. Only someone familiar with the stark corridors of those orphanages would recognize the truth. This composure was the residue of lifelong vigilance. Depression threaded itself through their daily lives in ways they rarely understood. Some woke each morning with a dull heaviness that felt permanent. Others drifted into long stretches of isolation, their eyes lingering on the floor, not out of humility, but because looking upward felt unfamiliar. Joy came slowly, almost cautiously. Smiles formed as if testing whether they were allowed. Emotional expression was something they had never been encouraged to practice, and adulthood did not suddenly unlock the ability. Connection was another terrain they struggled to navigate. Trust required a foundation they had never been given. A hand on the shoulder, a casual gesture of concern, often made them tense. They were not reacting to danger, they were reacting to newness. Touch associated with comfort did not exist in their memories. The idea of relying on another person, friend, spouse, or stranger, felt like a risk they could not calculate. Social bonds formed around them, yet seldom included them. They listened politely to conversations about family, affection, childhood moments filled with laughter, but they remained silent, unable to contribute to something they had never experienced. A young woman once described her relationships as windows she could look through but never open. Many shared this feeling. They could observe warmth, but not inhabit it. Their emotional vocabulary had been shaped by institutions where affection was rare and discipline constant. When others spoke of belonging, they nodded out of courtesy, carrying inside them a hollow space where such belonging should have lived. Some drifted into darker circumstances. The world beyond the orphanages required social understanding, negotiation, empathy, and patience. Without these skills, certain individuals turned to crime, not out of intent, but out of confusion. Theft, deceit, and violence became quick solutions for problems they did not know how else to meet. They were described as troubled, defiant, or dangerous, but no one asked who had taught them the only forms of response they knew. Society punished them for the very patterns that institutions had engraved into their early lives. Even those who stayed within the boundaries of the law bore invisible marks. They struggled with sudden noises, which stirred memories of punishment behind stone walls. They woke from dreams filled with shadows and unfinished cries. Unexpected kindness unsettled them more deeply than cruelty. They approached relationships as though walking across thin ice, afraid that any misstep would break the fragile surface beneath them. Loneliness followed them not because they sought it, but because it was the only terrain that felt familiar. What stood out most was how they watched other families. They observed parents comforting children, couples arguing and reconciling, and siblings teasing one another. Their eyes softened briefly, then tightened again with quiet resignation. They had grown up in a world where tenderness was a myth whispered but never demonstrated. Domestic life appeared to them like a distant country, visible yet unreachable. In time, they faded into the background of the communities that absorbed them. People identified them by their quiet habits: the worker who never raised a voice, the neighbor who kept to themselves, the wanderer who avoided crowds. These descriptions were not inaccurate, but they failed to capture the deeper truth. Each of these individuals carried the imprint of institutional childhood. Rooms without warmth, years without affection, routines without meaning. Two kinds of survivors emerged from such places: those who turned inward until the silence consumed them, and those who externalized their wounds because expression was the only defense they had ever learned. Both paths reflected environments that had raised children without love, without safety, without the basic recognition that they were more than bodies to be managed. They stepped into adulthood, shaped by corridors that the world had long forgotten. They carried emotional fractures that never fully aligned. Even as the years softened their edges, somewhere within their quiet persistence, a faint shift begins to rise, hinting at lives that might bend away from the shadows that shaped their earliest days. A small number of children managed to step beyond the boundaries that had defined their earliest years. Though the path they followed was neither straight nor bright, their progress unfolded quietly, almost cautiously, as though they feared that any sudden movement might draw the attention of forces eager to pull them back into the structures they had escaped. It began with moments that seemed insignificant from the outside: being assigned to help in a workshop, being noticed by a villager, and being allowed to work beyond the orphanage walls. These were small openings, barely visible cracks in the system's iron surface. Yet for a few, they widened into possibilities. Some learned simple trades: weaving, carpentry, milling, tending animals. The training was rudimentary, more a collection of repeated motions than true instruction, but it offered a sense of direction that had never existed inside the institution. Tasks that required patience suited them. They were accustomed to long hours of structured silence. A child who had spent years sweeping stone corridors could adapt to sweeping the floors of a shop. A child who had been forced to sort donated scraps could learn to sort grain or wool. The transition was not dramatic. It was gradual, steady, almost invisible. The rare cases where a child was taken in by a family created outcomes that observers often remembered as miracles. Sometimes it was a widow who needed help with chores, or a craftsman who took pity on a quiet boy standing alone near the marketplace. Other times, it was a travelling merchant who saw potential in a child's calm demeanour. These adoptions were informal, unrecorded, and fragile. The child's position in the household was often unclear, neither a true family member nor a servant. Yet even that uncertainty was gentler than the rigid hierarchy of the orphanage. In these homes, some children encountered tenderness for the first time. It was rarely expressed directly. Instead, it appeared in small gestures: a cup of warm broth left on a table, a blanket added to a bedding pile, a brief acknowledgement after a task was done well. These gestures, ordinary to others, landed with surprising weight. The children did not know how to respond. They hesitated, their faces still and unreadable, unsure whether these offerings were genuine or tests. Trust formed slowly, in layers, like thin ice hardening over a winter pond. A few absorbed skills more quickly than expected. They became competent apprentices, quiet helpers, and reliable workers. Their restraint, shaped by years of institutional discipline, made them valuable in trades requiring concentration. A blacksmith once remarked that a former orphan worked like someone who feared being forgotten, though he meant it as praise. These individuals learned to anchor themselves to their tasks, finding stability in repetition. Yet even among those who managed to build new lives, the past never vanished. It remained in the way they reacted to raised voices, how they flinched when someone approached too quickly, how they apologized before speaking. People around them noticed these habits but did not understand their origins. The orphanages themselves were distant places, physically and emotionally. Few wanted to discuss them. Fewer still wished to acknowledge what they had taken from the children who survived them. For those who succeeded, resilience did not bloom naturally. It formed under pressure. They learned to navigate the spaces between expectation and survival. They adapted to the demands of work, the rhythms of households, and the rules of towns, but the fragility remained beneath each step. Every accomplishment rested on unstable foundations, a chance encounter, a sympathetic stranger, a moment of favorable timing. Remove any one of these elements, and the outcome would have been different. The proportion of children who escaped the cycle was extremely small. They did not represent a triumph of the system, but the exception that revealed its failures. Their stories circulated quietly, often embellished, to reassure communities that the institutions were not entirely bleak. People pointed to these few survivors as proof that opportunity existed, or that hard work could bring success. These claims overlooked the far larger number who never received any opportunity at all. By contrast, the majority remained confined to the roles the orphanages shaped for them. Labourers without agency, servants without futures, individuals who internalized the belief that their lives held limited worth. The few who defied this trajectory did so not because the system allowed it, but because circumstance bent momentarily in their favour. Their survival was not evidence of fairness, it was evidence of imbalance. The world interpreted these rare stories as hope, but the children themselves carried a different understanding. They knew how thin the thread of their escape had been. They remembered friends who did not survive, names that had disappeared from the orphanage rosters without explanation. Their gratitude was often accompanied by guilt, a sense that they had stepped into a life meant for someone else. The road forward was possible, yet shadowed. Still, these individuals built new routines. They learned to offer small kindnesses to others, remembering how deeply such gestures had mattered to them. Some became helpers in workshops, others caretakers, others quiet presences in their towns. Their impact was subtle, but real. They bore witness to what survival looked like when measured not in triumph, but in persistence. Their steps beyond the orphanage walls revealed a narrow path carved out of chance rather than fairness. Their quiet accomplishments carried the imprint of all they had endured and all they could never reclaim. Beneath the fragile successes they managed to build, a deeper current waits, guiding the story toward the shadows that shaped every life caught inside that system. The legacy of the medieval orphanage system did not end at the edges of its stone walls. It stretched outward, following the children long after they stepped into adulthood, and continued into the generations that came after them. It shaped not only individual lives, but the social fabric surrounding them, creating patterns of silence, distance, and erasure that persisted far beyond the era that produced them. What lingered most was not the architecture or the records, but the invisible imprint left on those who passed through its corridors. The first mark of this legacy appeared in the way these individuals occupied space in the world. Many grew into adults who felt as though they could not be fully seen. Their presence was muted, shaped by early lessons that taught them to remain unobtrusive. They entered communities without drawing attention, speaking softly, stepping carefully. People often described them as polite or reserved, but the truth was quieter than that. They had learned early on that being unnoticed was a form of protection. This habit formed the foundation of a generation the world would barely remember. A generation without clear identities, without family ties, without the anchors that most people relied upon. This invisibility extended to how society perceived them. Communities rarely acknowledged the structures that had produced the emotional distance these adults carried. Instead, they interpreted the survivors through convenient labels: humble, simple, timid. These descriptions erased the violence of their upbringing and replaced it with stereotypes that made their struggles easier to ignore. The world preferred not to examine the institutions too closely. It was easier to accept a narrative of benevolence than to confront the darker truth under its surface. One of the most troubling parts of this legacy was the illusion of charity that framed the entire system. The orphanages were often praised as acts of compassion, symbols of religious duty and moral righteousness. Yet the help they provided was conditional, controlled, and often punitive. What was presented as salvation was, in daily practice, a mechanism of containment. Children were kept alive, but seldom nurtured. They were managed, not raised. This created a model of humanitarianism that emphasized obedience over dignity, survival over growth. Generations later, the echoes of this model could still be felt in how societies approached vulnerability. Programs meant to offer support often mirrored medieval structures, strict rules, moral judgments, and limited autonomy. The belief that aid must be earned, that suffering must be disciplined, did not originate in modern thought. It had deep roots in the medieval orphanage system. The children who grew up under those rules internalized them, and in adulthood, they sometimes repeated them, continuing a cycle of rigid expectations and emotional scarcity. Another part of the legacy remained hidden in how these individuals formed relationships. Many struggled to build families of their own, not because they lacked affection, but because they carried emotional patterns that made closeness difficult. They entered partnerships cautiously, uncertain of their own worth. Some avoided raising children out of fear that they might repeat what had been done to them. Others longed deeply for connection, but could not articulate it, having never learned the language of tenderness. These private struggles created ripples that extended into the next generation. Children raised by parents who themselves had never been nurtured. Communities also absorbed this legacy. Over time, they developed an unspoken understanding that some people simply came from nowhere. These individuals were not tied to long-standing family lines, nor represented in local histories. Without ancestry or inheritance, they existed as footnotes in records dominated by landowners, clergy, and merchants. This absence reinforced the idea that their lives were less significant, less worthy of remembrance. The medieval system's erasure of identity persisted, even after its buildings crumbled. The loneliest part of the legacy remained in memory. Or rather, in its absence, most of the children who passed through these institutions left no written record, no family stories, no descendants eager to preserve their names. Generations later, their existence survived only in statistical estimates or vague mentions in monastic archives. Entire lifetimes had unfolded and ended without leaving a visible trace. This quiet erasure formed a shadow across the centuries, reminding anyone who looked closely how many stories had been lost. Despite this, there were small countercurrents, moments when the legacy revealed something more complicated. Some survivors, despite the weight of their past, offered unexpected compassion to others. Their silence, instead of hardening into indifference, softened into attentiveness. They recognized suffering quickly, responded without hesitation, and carried empathy shaped by their own experiences of abandonment. Though few in number, they demonstrated how resilience could emerge from neglect, how strength could be forged in places designed to suppress it. Yet, these rare exceptions could not erase the broader truth. The medieval orphanage system produced generations marked by absence of identity, of affection, of opportunity. It created a lineage of invisibility, a quiet thread woven into the fabric of history. The scars it left were not dramatic. They were subtle, diffuse, and enduring. They lived in the ways people avoided eye contact, in the hesitations before speaking, in the instinct to step aside rather than forward. Their lives carried a weight shaped long before they could speak, etched into them by years of being managed rather than known. Their stories, scattered and faint, reveal a system that shaped societies as much as it shaped children. At the edge of this long shadow waits the final truth about what these institutions were built to do, and whom they were built to silence. They were not places where childhood could take root. They were not sanctuaries, nor shelters, nor sites of hope. The medieval orphanages that lined the edges of towns and cloisters existed for a quieter purpose, one that unfolded behind stone walls and dim corridors to keep certain lives out of view. The children who entered these institutions were not welcomed in the way a family welcomes a newborn. They were managed, hidden, and contained. Their presence served a function, yet their humanity remained unacknowledged. What lay beneath the surface was a truth that few in their own time recognized, and fewer still dared to speak aloud. These orphanages were designed less to nurture than to remove, removing the discomfort of public suffering, removing the inconvenience of abandoned infants, removing the social complications that came with children who had no lineage to claim them. Every stone in those walls seemed arranged to ensure not that the children lived well, but that the outside world did not have to confront them. Those who entered the system were marked from the start. Their names changed, their histories erased. A child might arrive with a note tucked into a blanket, a crude symbol, a scrap of cloth meant to signal identity or hope. Within days, these tokens disappeared into drawers or monastery archives, and the child was folded into the institution's routine. Their origins dissolved, their future narrowed. What remained was a kind of sanctioned invisibility. Inside the corridors, survival did not resemble living. The children existed according to strict rhythms: hours of labor, hours of silence, and hours of prayer. The structure appeared orderly from a distance, even admirable to those who believed discipline healed the human soul. But within the walls, the order hid the absence of care. No one asked what comfort the children needed. No one wondered how fear shaped their sleep. No one paused to consider whether their small hands trembled from cold or hunger. Their value was measured in obedience, not well-being. The institution treated their lives like small flames, to be kept burning only at the lowest possible cost. Food was sparse, warmth inconsistent, affection non-existent. Illness swept through rooms without urgency. Sometimes a child vanished from the sleeping quarters, their bed left half-made. A whispered explanation circulated. A fever, a seizure, a breath that stopped in the night. By morning, the remaining children learned not to ask questions. Maintaining silence was the first lesson they mastered. Outsiders believed the orphanages represented charity. They imagined monks and nuns nurturing abandoned infants, guiding them towards spiritual salvation. This image soothed the conscience of communities that preferred not to witness poverty or suffering too closely. But the truth beneath that image was far heavier. The institutions offered the appearance of moral order, while quietly absorbing the consequences of neglect, shame, and abandonment. They satisfied society's desire to feel compassionate without requiring genuine responsibility. Children grew up within this structure as though suspended between existence and erasure. They spoke little, observed much, and learned to navigate the world with a kind of practiced caution. They learned to silence discomfort, to manage fear, to avoid drawing attention. Even when they stepped into adulthood, the orphanage remained with them, woven into their gestures, their hesitations, the way their eyes drifted downward when addressed. Generations later, the legacy of these institutions lingered in fragments. A few scattered diary notes from clergy, a handful of incomplete rosters, occasional mentions of orphan labour borrowed by local farms. But the children themselves, their voices, their thoughts, their everyday struggles, vanished almost entirely. They left behind no letters, no family law, no graves marked with names. In the quiet spaces of history, they receded like smoke. When historians searched for their stories, they encountered gaps, omissions, and deliberate silences. It was as though the children had lived behind a veil that refused to lift. But perhaps that was the point. The system not only hides them physically, it mutes their impact on the world. They were allowed to exist, but not to belong. They were permitted to breathe, but not to matter. Imagine walking through one of those orphanages at dusk. The corridors are narrow, lit by a single fading lantern. The air is still, as though sound itself hesitates to move. A row of wooden beds stretches across a room where the children lie quietly. Some awake, some pretending to sleep. Their faces carry no expression, not because they are emotionless, but because expression has never been safe. Somewhere outside, a church bell marks the hour, yet the sound feels distant, as if meant for another world entirely. You might look at these children and wonder what futures awaited them. Some would become labourers, nameless in the records of the towns they served. Some would die before adulthood, their absence noted only by the sudden emptiness of a bed. A rare few might find a path beyond the walls, yet even they would carry the imprint of the institution in every step. The darkest truth is not that the orphanages failed to protect them. It is that the orphanages were never designed to protect them at all. Their true function was to shield society from its own discomfort, to keep abandoned lives from complicating the moral order, to keep unwanted children from becoming visible reminders of inequality, desire, violence, or despair. These children were not saved, they were managed. They were not raised, they were processed. Their lives served as quiet proof that a society can preach virtue while sustaining systems built on silence and suffering. And the silence worked. History absorbed it. Centuries passed, and their stories dissolved into faint shadows behind monastic walls. Now, when we examine the remnants of that world, we are left with fragments, enough to understand the outlines, not enough to restore the voices. We see, with unsettling clarity, that these institutions shaped more than children. They shaped the worldview of entire societies. They taught generations that certain lives could be erased quietly, without consequence. They were places designed to hide sorrow, not heal it. They carried children forward only far enough to keep them out of sight. And long after their doors closed, the world continued to forget the ones who entered, as if forgetting were the final task the system required. Thank you for staying until the end of this long, heavy journey into a forgotten corner of history. May your night be gentle, your rest undisturbed, and your thoughts a little quieter as you drift into sleep. Good night.